This tape is about the warping of American public sensibilities. I decided to go into this topic for which I have experience going through the Vietnam War and the war in Central America to the present time concerning the Middle East. But I decided to go into it because of the support that goes on for Israel in Western media. I realize that there's an alternative media approach to that, blaming Western media for all of it, which carries the weight of its own mischief. And they weigh in with the idea that if you see through Western media, you should therefore align with them. It's bad enough that there's no way out of this us versus them power struggle, but that the whole thing turns out to be duplicity. Now, the warping of American sensibilities has a touchstone, it has a thought basis in why people vote for Donald Trump or even Kamala Harris. It's the idea that from the days of Father Knows Best antenna TV, things were kept simple because the idea of America was something that everybody could identify and understand. And we know that Donald Trump loses interest if it becomes too complicated. So we vote for him because we don't want complicated explanations for the things that the government does. The complications of the situations that we create come to something of a new commonplace, which is distrust in government. People trace this to the qualitative and momentous shift in public feelings of safety caused by the assassination of JFK. A sudden shift in American sensibilities that has been drowned out by the long interval that stand between now and then. But it was significant enough that many people who lived through it and remember it still can identify how heartbreaking the change was for them. The change, from the point of view of pure academics, may not really have been something JFK was not caught up in. But the unraveling of the hope that America would tell its people the truth and the government could be trusted to explain simply but wisely in accordance with our best interests and public relations with the rest of the world came apart when things began to become strangely clear about the undercurrents of, for example, the Vietnam War, where a lot of drug smuggling was going on. The influence of the drug smuggling was felt all through the United States in the sex, drug, and rock and roll curse put on the 60s after Kennedy and King were done in. The terrible disappointment of King's loss led to the belligerent side of black culture gaining the upper hand, even to the point of black leadership among Vietnam pro-war veterans So the idea that we could turn to black people for Christian leadership and sensibilities of goodwill between us was undone by these disappointments. Another example concerns me as the grandson of distinguished residents of Topeka, Kansas. I made clear that the person attacking me is Diamanda Gullis, who has leadership of a faction of sadistic knife attackers in Seattle, Washington. Because I was outspoken in my belief that the tax and spend warmongering of the U.S. government was the most loud and clear identifiable corruption in our society, that it was making the world unsafe as a practice to justify itself, made Topeka hesitant to regard, of all people, Diamanda Gullis as anything other but one of them. Reagan, Diamanda Gullis, David Bowie, Peter Gabriel, Barack Obama, David Jeffen, Nosferatu, George Bush, the Black Panthers, all united against little Jim McQueebate. Queebate was some strange alien mutation that didn't actually belong to Ward and Marie Moore of Topeka. Why would they go in such a direction? It seems to me that for their own sanity, they should have picked and choose among the lot of people with whom they branded me. It doesn't seem to me to be in the interest of Josh Hawley of Missouri, where my grandparents lived for a long time in Poplar Bluff as distinguished residents, distinguished citizens by vote of council, to side with a woman who was involved in the attacks on the World Trade Center, the anthrax attacks, and the claim that mayhem in the name of John Lennon was an appropriate recourse for the AIDS victims culture of gay society in Seattle, in defiance of the evidence that Diamanda Gullis herself was involved not only in the anthrax, but in the AIDS attack too. So Topeka will side with the AIDS attack rather than distinguished residents of Poplar Bluff. Well, the alternative would be to disentangle me from the idea that I'm some sort of alien mutation, because I don't like that idea. And I didn't like that idea enough to talk about Ronald Reagan's lighthearted ideas about giving poor people in breadlines botulism, for example, which he did. And it led me to my discovery of a great mystery in American film that I call the Film Project. UW Dialectical and Yoko Ono, led by Ringo Starr, a murderous poisoner of children, a murderous advocate for Nosferatu, an evil, sadistic, obsessed tormentor of me. Ringo Starr came down from what they call on high and brutalized me and everything that I cared about, making up a story, a fable, a fiction, an absurdity about somehow having Hawker's injuries to what happened with John Lennon, which doesn't even seem to be a storyline that is real. And it comes out that Yoko Ono had a reason for a grudge, to have a curse against my father and against our house. So the sensibilities of Topeka allowed for senior faculty of the University of Pittsburgh to be avenged by Japanese martial extremists on LSD in the Dakota. The warping of American sensibilities comes about most conspicuously in the carnage in Gaza. The warping of American sensibilities takes the idea that we can and should and are honor bound and capable of protecting people in minorities like the Jews from beasts among us like Adolf Hitler. And yet, faced with that, we fail to do anything constructive when it happens to those very kind of people: the weak, the vulnerable, the beautiful, the self-possessed, the proud, the dignified, the courteous, the lovely, the charming, the entertaining, the enjoyable. The heartfelt leadership of the people of Gaza shines through all of this again and again. What we find is that Egypt cahooted with Israel to set up the supernova rave. The people who were in Hamas were not respectable people, but the people in Israel were even worse. What they should have done was secure the crime scene and demand the surrender of the perpetrators and taken precautions that it never happen again. They should have engaged in civilized exchanges, negotiations, and demanded peace be prevailed. But they used it as an excuse for genocidal destruction, and we're not going to cheer that, are we? No, we're not going to cheer that. No. Its roots are in something complicated that took place in the Middle East under Bush, Clinton, and Obama. The dehumanization, the hardening our heart, the averting our eyes from all things Muslim is absurd. The Muslims were the people who brought an end to the Dark Ages by preserving the Greeks and giving them to Erasmus, who wrote an introduction to the New Testament talking about the Greeks, thanks to the Muslims. Thank you, Islamic world. From the bottom of my heart, thank you for ending the Dark Ages with that gift to Erasmus. ISIS was a noxious development in the Middle East. But much of what we've seen over the last year has been punishing the people who put ISIS down by the U.S. deep state, who brought about ISIS through mayhem in Iraq, through lies about that mayhem in Iraq. Hezbollah put down ISIS, and they were punished with a nightmarish chain reaction pager assassination bombing spree, a form of drone warfare from the spinner beanies of Nosferatu, which the media, in full blaring conspicuous collaborationism, dared to cheer, punishing people who were only trying to protect our genuine interest in the Middle East, who were only trying to protect their wives, their children, their families, and their friends from a nightmare of irrational extremism that was beheading people as a result of the mayhem that we wrought in Iraq for no reason whatsoever. So to keep it simple, we were lied to by the deep state. Now, Robert Kennedy's campaign made a great deal of that, but he continued to participate in the glorification of Israel. Trump is coming into power with the mindset that there's no going back. The estrangement, they say, is permanent. We will never find a way of redeeming our name. And Trump will jettison all public relations that don't underwrite the change that has happened as success in imperial conquest. The sandbaggers are a form of media who discuss things like why people would side with Syria, what Iran is really trying to do, what China and Russia contribute to the world around us. They include George Galloway of the Workers' Party. What they never touch is the way that I was tortured by Gail Burslem. Because the world's fundamentalist system, people like Bork of the Supreme Court, Reagan, Gorbachev, Putin, the Russian Orthodox Church, Al Qaeda, and even some of the feminists of Palestine, for some reason subscribe to the idea that it would be fun to help the Pittsburgh Pirates, the Pittsburgh Steelers, and the Seattle Black Panthers torture a deaf white person who's been put up on a public pedestal through the hidden hand of Yoko Ono. They want to perniciously depict me as some sort of fine artist who owes my estate, my hard work, my suffering from Parkinson's that was inflicted by criminals to anybody who demands it from me because they created a neurological implant that causes terror in the face, blackmail, and extortion. And they call that the state of Washington, Olympia, capital of the state of Washington. They call that Josh Shapiro. They call that UW Dialectical's Board of Equity, the Arts Council of the British enthusiasm for this psychopathic melodrama from the pen hand of God knows who. There has never been an adequate explanation for Gail Burslem, but I have ferreted out some indicators of who was involved, including Blythe Sanders and Gabrielle D'Annunzio. It fades and dissolves like a movie through the age of Houdini, back to Fayum, a counterfeiting den. I'm dealing with the criminally insane. I'm not dealing with rational, normal, everyday bumpkins who just live for duplicity and hypocrisy because that's the nature of reality. I'm dealing with deviants who strategize this whole thing. I'm doing my level best to report it faithfully to you, whoever the hell you are, in the hopes that you see some sense in leaving someone who has been tortured alone. It's a hopeless wish because I know what Seattle, Washington is, what they do to people, and how they think. I'm up against the criminally insane in a place parched and dire, onerous, and vomit bag known as King County.